This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations, a show about problematic faves, great trash, difficult art, and our complex relationship with art and entertainment. My name's Hugh, I'm the host, and I'd like to put in a very mild content warning for this show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good. But sometimes there are aspects to the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Read the episode descriptions for more information and do be aware of your listening environment.
You're listening to Reserved Recommendations on Manawatu People's Radio Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This is a show about great trash and problematic faves and things like that. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome this evening's guest, Dylan Horrocks. How are you going, Dylan?
Good. I'm just wondering whether I'm anyone's problematic faves out there. Whether my books might be guilty pleasures for someone.
No one's raised it yet, but I suppose I would say that you, particularly with things like the Magic Pen, have done quite a good job of kind of addressing where the problems might be and how people might deal with them. I think you've been reasonably responsible with that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was my last book, and it kind of, I guess I was trying to explore some of the issues around really ethically dodgy stories and fantasies. But at the same time, I also kind of wanted to indulge them. I felt like it was dishonest to have a conversation about the ethics of fantasy without also including in that the voice of the pleasure and joys of fantasy. So yeah, I've always been disappointed no one's really complained about that book, but we'll see.
Well, I mean,
just be careful what I ask for.
Yeah, you'll be joining people in the castle in Pennsylvania in no time. I guess the idea of kind of the joy of guilty pleasures or finding where the joy is in these now problematic works of art is a pretty good jumping off point for the conversation that you said you wanted to have. You sent me 4 movies to watch, and I have dutifully watched them all. I got my children to help me with the Robin Hood one because I remembered watching that as a kid and it being quite good fun, and it still is. So the thing that you wanted to talk about was kind of old movies kind of from before the 1940s, really, and their particular joys and problems. So I guess you were saying the central one was that Errol Flynn Robin Hood movie, so maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, several years ago, I kind of went through a stage where I decided I was going to focus on watching movies older than me, and I was born in the mid-60s. So I really have focused over the last several years. My real indulgence has been watching films that are pre-1960, and the pre-40s ones are particularly interesting. But the Errol Flynn Robin Hood, it's from 1938, and I guess I must have seen it as a kid on television, probably. When I was growing up on television, they didn't have that much material, I guess, to show. So they filled in a lot of slots with old movies. And I guess also when I was growing up, they weren't that old. I mean, when I was in the 70s, when I was in primary school, this Robin Hood film would have been, I guess, like 35 years old. And when I think back, that takes us now to about, 1985?
Yeah, something like that. So
and 80s movies don't seem that old now.
No, I was going to say that would let you have like E.T. or anything like that quite happily, and it would be the same sort of gap.
Exactly. Yeah, Ferris Bueller or something. yeah, so yeah, I guess they were on television all the time, these early films, and also my dad taught film. He was a lecturer in film at university. He kind of just about invented film studies in New Zealand.
Wow!
And so I grew up watching all kinds of things because if he was going to show a film to his class, this was before video, and so he had to rent the film and get a projector. He learned how to be a projectionist, and he would show the film to his class in the lecture theatre. But the night before, he would often bring the film home with the projector, and he'd project it on the living room wall so that he could take notes and make sure there was nothing missing and so on. And so I kind of grew up watching all kinds of stuff. And so I'm sure I saw, Robin Hood as a kid, this Errol Flynn one. But it was only a few years ago, about 4 years ago, that I sat down and watched it as an adult. And I don't know what I was expecting, but my God, I basically completely fell in love with Errol Flynn.
He is an astoundingly...
and also Olivia de Havilland.
He is an astoundingly charismatic man in that film in particular. I watched it with my 2 young daughters, and they were both very taken with him, jumping on tables and doing all of the... It's now cliched because everyone was ripping off Errol Flynn Robin Hood stuff,
Exactly. Yeah, this is it's like the... to me, it feels like it's the action movie. It's like it's the original swashbuckling hero movie. Having said that, it's not really the original because it's borrowing a whole lot of stuff from earlier silent adventure films, including in particular the now I'm blanking on the earlier one. But I will I will find it. But it's sort of it invented a lot of the tropes and the set pieces and so on, and a lot of the narrative tricks that we're familiar with the cliched version of Robin Hood. But it really, every time I sit down and watch that film again now, what oozes off the screen is charisma. It's just the incredible electric presence of Errol Flynn, as he sort of casually, lackadaisically lolls in a chair with a sensual half smile that he's throwing at his enemies, waiting for them to attack him. And he's got no fear. He's just completely relaxed in every situation. And yeah, he's an extraordinary presence on the screen. He electrifies it. And actually, Olivia de Havilland as well, who plays Maid Marian. The romance is a very, very central part of it. And I think part of what, when I watched it 4 years ago, I hadn't watched a film in ages that just made me feel so good. I came away from it just feeling gleefully happy. It's an expression of pure joy through pretty much the whole length of the film.
Yeah, it's. I found it very interesting because you made the point of it sort of being a kind of an action movie, but it wouldn't really be done to make an action movie in this day and age where your hero is so kind of uncomplicated. He's a guy who really enjoys getting into fights, and the fights are largely consequence-free for him pretty much all of the time, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and there's no moral complexity. The bad guys are bad, and the good guys are good, and there's no shades of grey in this film at all. Robin Hood is the hero of the poor, the hero of the oppressed. He's fearless. He's happy to provoke the bad guys, even when they outnumber him enormously, because, as you say, nothing bad's going to happen to him. We know nothing's going to happen to him. He knows nothing's going to happen to him. It's just play. It's pure childish play. And I think that the purity of that childishness of it is so pleasurable and so kind of, there is a liberating feeling to it, because you just feel like you can be completely self-indulgent watching it.
The childish...
except, of course, the world isn't like that.
No.
And, apologies, I've got... my connection dropped out for a moment.
Oh, okay. I'll
apologies about that. I don't know how that messes things up.
Let me turn my camera off, and we'll see if that makes life easier. The thing I was saying was that childishness is
that may help.
An interesting thing to bring up, because the kind of marker of good antagonists as opposed to bad antagonists in the movie is that the good ones, like Friar Tuck and Little John, are people that Robin gets into fights with and beats up, and then they become best friends.
Yes. Again, just like kids playing. I mean, it's total playground stuff throughout, really. But Maid Marian, the romance, has this whole thing running through where it starts with Maid Marian thinks Robin Hood is contemptible. He's a terrible, terrible person, and they have this kind of love-hate thing for a while. He's smitten straight away, of course, but he ends up taking her captive, but treats her extremely chivalrously, and gradually she just completely falls for him. And again, it's just such a childish fantasy. But it's these days, looking on it now, it's kind of complicated. That's one of the things that I find so interesting about watching older films is you get to see how the daydreams, the fantasies, the wish fulfillment fantasies and so on, but also the ideas of what's straightforward and ethical and uncomplicated, those have changed. They've changed over time, and so some even in Robin Hood, which feels like such a sort of pure, straightforward, childish fantasy. Even in that, there are some complicated things now, which it feels like they weren't so complicated to a lot of the audiences then.
Well, I mean, for one thing, the bad king, King John, he is fairly queer coded.
Yeah, he's just a straight up baddie. And actually, I feel like Guy of Gisborne is a slightly more complicated character, and the Sheriff of Nottingham and so on. They're slightly more ambiguous. They kind of there are times when it feels like they're kind of tricked into things by John. At times one almost feels a bit sympathetic towards them, because Robin Hood he's quite mean to them. He kind of manipulates them and is mean to them, plays nasty tricks, and one can almost feel a bit sympathetic towards them. But mostly, it's pretty straightforward. They're taxing the poor, and they treat the poor very badly, and also they kind of snivel, they behave in a way that's unpleasant. But that's part of what's interesting, is the idea that that bad guys sort of are clearly bad because of the way they move, the way they talk, their gestures, often the way they look in early films. And that in itself is problematic, because the idea that people who are disfigured or walk in a particular way, they're sort of clumsy, or they appear slovenly, the idea that makes them, that's a clear indication that they're evil. That's part of some old ideas about how ethics were built in, and so they also gave shape to your body, the shape of your skull and things like that. And of course, that led to some awful things being done to people who were completely innocent people. They just happened to look the wrong way.
Robin certainly does embody a very 30s idea of kind of perfected manliness, and everyone being kind of defined in opposition to him that way is it's definitely a thing that you notice as an adult that I wouldn't have as a child, I think.
Well, it's an interesting film about masculinity, I think. Robin is presented as the perfect man, and that's, of course, why Marion can't help but swoon for him once she sees what he's really like. And part of that masculinity is an arrogance. He's extraordinarily arrogant. And because he's Errol Flynn, he manages to make it really appealing and charismatic. But actually, it's also a pretty terrible characteristic to put at the center of masculinity. He's arrogant. He takes what he wants. He doesn't compromise. And yet, Errol Flynn, he's such an interesting presence because he's quite beautiful. Like, he's not just ruggedly handsome. He is beautiful, and he plays to that beauty. And he moves his body in a particular way, like a dancer. He has a lot of characteristics that a lot of people, certainly by the 1980s and so on, would have considered feminine and effeminate. And he spends the whole film wearing tights, for God's sake. And he has long curling locks and so on. It always interests me that we think we have a handle on the cliches and the stereotypes, but when you actually go and look closely at the source material that has shaped a lot of those stereotypes, it's always more complicated. There's always layers and layers and contradictions in it. And Errol Flynn, as this kind of quintessential masculine hero, there are some complicated androgynous aspects to him. And I feel like the appeal of him is sometimes almost closer to the appeal of a hero in a lot of anime or manga, of the sort of masculine hero who's actually quite effeminate by Western Hollywood standards, or K-pop heroes, K-pop singers and so on. I feel like it's the complexity of it is part of what makes these films so compelling to me. There's the surface pleasures of an uncomplicated, childish bit of fun, but there's all the complex shadows underneath that, and there's the different layers that fit into the cliches that we now think are simple, but they've never been simple. It's always been complicated.
I think perhaps a digression we could make then to talk about the layers, and perhaps also where that kind of arrogance would go if the charisma maybe failed a bit, is one of the other movies that you sent me to watch was Oklahoma, which is deeply weird. I firstly, I didn't realize how many of the songs I already knew, just on a kind of genetic level without ever having consciously heard them. But also, like, talking about the way that Robin Hood positions kind of a particular kind of masculinity as obviously good, and then opposes people to it, the way that Oklahoma creates its villain, by just having him not be as good looking as everybody else, and maybe it's implied that he looks at dirty pictures. That was very strange indeed.
Oklahoma utterly fascinates me because this is the 1955 film of Oklahoma, which is a Rodgers and Hammerstein stage musical. But the 1955 film, which is directed by Fred Zinnemann, who's a really wonderful director, and the cinematography is absolutely stunning as well. It's a visually breathtaking film and really brilliantly staged and directed. It's enormously pleasurable on those surface levels. But you're right, it's one of the weirdest films I've ever seen. It's so dark. And actually, it's really corrupt. I mean, I kind of found it. I remember when I started watching it a few years ago. I don't know if I had seen this one before, but I started watching it, and the first 5 minutes I'm thinking, oh, this is just sheer self-indulgent fluff. It's really visual, beautifully shot, but it has this wonderful opening shot where the camera is moving through a field of corn, which is towering over the camera. So you're just sort of gliding through this corn, and then the corn opens up, and you're looking out across this beautiful vista, this landscape, with a cowboy riding towards you from a distance. He just gets closer and closer, and it's a fantastic shot. But what a dark, creepy story. That same hero, as you say, he's presented as he's the love interest. He's the hero of the film. He does some appalling things over the course of the film.
His first interaction with
the villain, the main thing that's...
Sorry, I was going to say his first interaction with the presumed villain is that he tries to convince him to commit suicide, and this is with no real establishing context about who these people are. And so you're just watching someone try and goad someone else into suicide in song, kind of for no reason.
Yeah, that scene sits right in the middle of the film. And up until that moment, there's things in the film that feel a little weird and problematic, but mostly it seems fairly light. And then that scene is one of the darkest scenes I've ever seen in a film. And from that moment on, the film just continues with a very dark undercurrent. So they're rivals. I mean, as far as the hero is concerned, they are rivals for the woman who the hero is courting. And so what he does is he goes to see the villainous fellow who's, as you say, he's unattractive, but he's also poor. Like, he's very much he's not really even working class. He's poorer than that. Most of the characters in this, I guess you could say, are sort of rural farming figures. The hero is a cowboy, which makes him kind of working class. But the villain, Judd, he's poorer than that. He just lives on the edge of the farm and does bit work for people.
And his introduction...
Somehow that seems to make him into a bad guy.
Yeah, and his introduction, actually, is the old woman of the house saying how they couldn't possibly run the farm without him. So that was the thing that made it so jarring for me, is that he was presented as kind of grumpy, but actually everything that everyone had said about him up to that point was that he was a hard worker and he was vital to keep the farm running. And then this guy just starts in on him from nowhere.
Yeah, he's an essential worker. We know everyone treats essential workers. That scene where the main character, the hero, Curly, goes to Judd's sort of slovenly shed, and it's so creepy. He basically tries to talk him into committing suicide. He tries to sort of trick him into it. He sings this song about how, gosh, if only he were dead, people would say nice things about him, and they'd sing songs about him, and he'd have a lovely funeral, and so on. And poor old Judd, he kind of starts to get caught up, and he's like, oh yeah, and he ends up joining him in a duet, singing the song about how nice it would be if he was dead. You feel like he's just about to give in. It's the most utterly disturbing scene. It's really, really, and from that moment on, like, Curly is possibly the most evil person in this film, if not one of the most evil people I've ever seen. And yet he continues to be the hero for the rest of the film. And then at the end of the film, I don't know if I should give you any spoilers.
Well, I think...
to go and see it, and they don't like spoilers. But
I think spoiling 60-year-old movies is probably... It's more than 60, 70-year-old movies is probably safe.
Yeah, the thing is, I'm someone who loves spoilers. I actually, before I go to any film for the first time, I look it up online and see if I can get the full synopsis. I want to know everything that's going to happen in the film before I see it. I don't like sitting there being anxious about what's going to happen. I much prefer to know what's going to happen, and then I can just sit back and relax and soak up the sort of visual narrative experience without tension and anxiety. Because I don't enjoy tension. I don't find that pleasurable. But yeah, I know I'm a bit unusual in wanting spoilers. But let's just say at the end of Oklahoma, things come to a head. The villain Judd, of course, meets a sorry end, probably at the hands of the hero. And then there's a judge on the scene, and basically people are saying, a couple of people say, oh, you're going to have to go to trial because you seem to have killed Judd. We're going to have a trial for you. And essentially all the locals say, oh, no, we can get around that. And they stage a kind of fake trial with the judge. They basically threaten the judge into overseeing a fake trial and letting him off. Physically threatening him. It's most extraordinary. But this is played for, this is supposedly a wonderful thing they're doing. It's everything about it is just so. And the other thing that's really creepy about it, of course, is that Oklahoma was named a state quite late in the history of the U.S. It's a big part of its identity and history, and it has a long history of appalling racism, genocidal violence against the Native Americans. It's all of that's completely invisible. I mean, this movie is a celebration of the state of Oklahoma. It relies on drawing on certain kind of cliched symbols of the state around cowboys and so on. I don't think there's a black face in the entire film, and there's certainly not a Native American in the film. And everything is so white and creepily white. It's I don't know. It's such a strange, dark, creepy film, and yet it's also so beautiful, so utterly beautiful as a film, and so compelling and fantastically well staged. It's in the way that Leni Riefenstahl used to make absolutely beautiful Nazi propaganda films, stunning films to watch, but utterly creepy. And I find Oklahoma extremely creepy too. But boy, I could watch this over and over again.
I mean, Leni Riefenstahl's an interesting comparison because I feel like they're both kind of propaganda, but she's being much more straightforward about it. She is making what is clearly Nazi propaganda. It says Nazi propaganda on the tin. But Oklahoma, the thing that makes it so weird to me is that there are all of these kind of assumptions about who is what kind of character and why and where the story is going to go and how it has to work out, which appear to have been made, before the movie started, and there's not really any kind of in-story justification to them. So Curly and I've forgotten the woman's name are introduced as kind of hating each other, or not, like being frustrated with each other. And I can see how they would think that was the romantic comedy trope where people start out bickering and then end up falling in love. But they don't really have the middle stage. They just, he murders Judd and then suddenly she's in love with him. Similarly, the thing about assuming Judd's a villain, there's this whole conflict between the cowboys and the ranchers, which is just kind of assumed to be a thing that everyone knows, and it's never explained or demonstrated. It's just they sing a song about it and then get in a fight.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, it's a film about the state of Oklahoma and about the kind of mythology of Oklahoma, and so that tension between the cowboys and the ranchers is kind of it's like, let's play out the modern history of Oklahoma in the 19th century. In a song. So it is hitting a lot of notes that probably would have been familiar to people as kind of emblematic of the kind of cute story of Oklahoma that people would tell, in a way that they probably aren't so obvious to us now watching them. I'll say just so the woman that Curly is courting, whose name's Laurie, she's played by Shirley Jones, who went on to become the mother in the Partridge Family TV series. So she played Shirley Partridge in the part. Did you ever watch the Partridge Family, or are you too young for that?
No. So I saw a lot of that kind of 70s TV, because I was born in 81, and I saw a lot of that 70s TV because it got even sort of through till the mid to late 90s, they would rerun things like that on TV. So I saw things like MASH and the Brady Bunch, but for whatever reason, the Partridge Family wasn't something that got rerun on New Zealand TV like that, so I didn't see it.
Yeah, I mean, the Partridge Family was basically the Brady Bunch with more songs. But yeah, she was certainly an icon of 1970s TV growing up as a kid. And yet at that point she was old enough to play the mum, rather than in Oklahoma, where she's the young potential teenage bride, I guess. Oklahoma feels, I feel like Oklahoma is one of the darkest films I have watched in the last few years, and yet it's also one of the lightest in terms of its tone. It's bright and colourful. It has wonderfully enjoyable dance sequences and songs. I think that's what I find so fascinating about it, is that it's such a strange combination of deeply dark and sort of frothily light. And it's hard to know how much the viewers in 1955 saw it as dark. I don't. And then surely they felt that that central scene was dark, but maybe that wasn't so bothersome to viewers. Certainly, when I read about Oklahoma online and I go looking for other people's reactions to it, the main response you get is older people waxing lyrical about what an enormously enjoyable, light, feel-good movie it is. And I feel like, God, did you see a different film? What, were you not paying attention to what was happening there? Yeah, really interesting.
It is. I mean, there is. It's just about time for our halfway break, but before that, I just wanted to mention that there is one kind of exception to the deliberate lightness and frothiness, which is that the reason that Laurie works out that Judd is a terrible person is that she has this completely insane hallucinatory dream dance sequence where she kind of flashes forward to the future if she married him. And that kind of feels like it's a completely different movie that just is in there by accident almost, because it's so weird.
Well, again, that's not an uncommon feature of, particularly in the 1950s, there were a lot of, on the surface, kind of quite straightforward Hollywood narrative films, but they'd have a little dream sequence in the middle, and the dream sequences were where the filmmakers got to really let rip and get in touch with their inner surrealist. And there's a whole bunch of films that do that. Another musical that has a really memorable one is An American in Paris, which is a spectacular musical. And towards the end of that, the whole last 20 minutes or so is one crazy, wild, choreographed dance number, which is a quite trippy fantasy sequence on a stage set. But yeah, it was actually quite common in a lot of films at the time to do that. Even in a way, the film Fantasia, the Disney animated film, has a couple of sequences like that too. It's funny. This was the period when the beat poets were busily dropping every drug they could and writing. Allen Ginsberg was writing Howl and so on. There was a kind of a beatnik thing emerging in the background, and I'm sure a lot of the filmmakers and people involved in these films they had one foot in that camp, and every chance they got to kind of push outside the envelope, they'd often take it with some really interesting results.
Yeah. All right, we are about at the halfway point, so we will take a brief break now, and we'll be back in just a second.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu, and you're listening to the show Reserved Recommendations, which is a show about problematic faves and great trash. I think we've probably said as much as can usefully be said about Oklahoma. I'm talking, by the way, to Dylan Horrocks. I should have reintroduced you. Very sorry.
I'm still here.
That's fantastic. There's probably not much more that can be usefully said about Oklahoma, I suspect, because I did want to talk about the other two movies, which were Son of Kong, which I would describe as kind of fantastically, gloriously dumb and really good fun. But also, I've forgotten its proper name, the Tarzan movie.
Yes, Tarzan and His Mate.
That's
which
right.
Was I think it was the second Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan film.
Now, I think I had watched the first one of those as a kid, but not that one, because there are a lot of boobs in that one, so it probably wasn't broadcast on British TV when I was a kid. And speaking of kind of dark and strange, that is quite astoundingly of its time in terms of like just kind of treating black people like disposable furniture.
Yep, absolutely. There's one of the things that I find interesting about those early Tarzan films and this one in particular is that there were probably more African American actors on the screen in that single film than there were in 500 other random Hollywood films. Like, there's a lot of African American actors in that film, but they're all dressed as African savages, and they die in enormous quantities and often behave very badly. And there are these, white explorers one of whom is particularly brutal and shoot a bear at some point.
Quite close to the start. He just executes a guy for being afraid of something. It kind of is an example to everybody else, and he kind of turns out to be villainous, but he doesn't really turn out to be villainous until he does something bad to Tarzan. There's no real hint that the movie thinks that just shooting people would make you a bad person.
Well, I think, again, this is a trope that turns up in a lot of the Tarzan stories. I've just recently been reading through a whole collection of Tarzan comics from the same period, from a little later, from the 40s and 50s, I think. And by that stage, the kind of Tarzan storyline cliches had been really set in concrete by all of these Hollywood films. And that's what the comics were very much based on. And it turns up again and again that you have white men who are turning up on a safari, and the ones who treat their bearers, who treat the natives badly, always turn out to be villainous and get their just desserts at some point. So in a way, I think they dropped that in early in the story to indicate this guy is going to turn into a villain. We are going to. This is an early sign that he's a bad guy. But the thing is that, the rest of the treating them that much better. It's just they have a sliding scale of what's considered to be appropriate ways to behave with other human beings, and if they are native bearers, the appropriate way to behave is not what we would think appropriate, hopefully, although an increasing number of people in America seem to be heading back to 1930s ideas about that. But yeah, it's the whole Tarzan story, of course, going right back to Edgar Rice Burroughs. It's classic kind of white savior stuff where a white infant is thrown into deepest, darkest Africa, but because he's white, he turns out to become better at living in the jungle than anybody else. There's a kind of underlying assumption that he has superior ethnic stock because he's white. So that Tarzan's deeply problematic from the get-go. And yet, part of what I find, I don't know. I keep watching and reading these problematic stories, partly because I'm trying to get my head around why are these stories so influential and so popular for so long for so many people. And I think it's very complicated. I think you get sometimes the kind of white supremacist subtexts are part of the appeal, I think, for the readers. But I also think with Tarzan, there's a whole there's a thing that was very popular in the 20s and 30s and shaped a lot of the pulp fiction and a lot of the popular adventure stories, which was a kind of yearning to get away from decadent civilization, which had turned particularly urban men into a kind of emasculated fops, is what they turned into. And so taking a European man and throwing him into the jungle to be raised by animals. I mean, it's getting in touch with the fact that humans are animals. It's accessing our kind of beast selves, and it echoes a whole lot of folklore around the relationship between humans and animals. So I feel like the Tarzan, I think you can call it a myth now. The Tarzan myth. It's about a lot of things, and one of the things it's about is the relationship of humans to the non-human world, to the jungle, to apes and gorillas and lions, and that it's as much about that as it is about racial fantasies. It's just that all of that gets tangled up with racial fantasies because that story was written after 200 years of race theory dominating white culture. But one of the things that interests me about Tarzan and his mate is that the other whole storyline is about sex. As you say, there's a lot of boobs in this film. It's very raunchy. It's very, very raunchy. There's a whole, like a 2-minute long scene where Tarzan and Jane swim underwater. She's completely naked, and they're swimming. It's filmed underwater. It's called the phrase people use for something like the underwater ballet. And the whole sequence is just them swimming around each other, sort of dancing around each other underwater. And she's clearly naked. And I think, is he naked, or he might have been wearing his loincloth?
I think
practically naked.
Still wearing the
throughout
loincloth.
Most of the film, throughout most of the film, he is almost naked. And when she's wearing her loincloth gear, she is practically naked, even more practically naked than him. It's extraordinarily sexual, and there's an amazing scene where it's in the morning, and they've clearly just had wild sex together because the previous night he got turned on by her wearing this fancy dress that the explorers had brought from England. And it's the perfume. It's the perfume that gets him going in a very animal way. And he picks her up and carries her off, and she's like, "Oh, here we go. This will be fun." And then you cut to them in the morning, and they're sleeping next to each other under these furs. And he wakes her up by blowing on her face, gently blowing on her face. And it's an extremely erotic sequence. And the thing about this film is that it was one of the last films released before the Hays Code was brought in. It was one of the films that provoked the new production code. It was coming in anyway, but the new office was so appalled by this film, the new production code office, that they insisted on changes. And there were some changes made before it was released. So there's different versions of this film floating around. But boy, it's one of the horniest films that I've ever seen. And it's from 1932.
The thing that really struck me about it once I got past the racism and particularly the odd thing where they make a big feature of Jane being naked underwater, but right at the start there are a whole bunch of topless black women just kind of in the background as scene dressing for no particular reason.
Oh, yeah.
But once I got past...
the National Geographic theory of nudity.
It is, yeah. Once I got past that, the thing that struck me about it is the way that... they clearly had like scenes they wanted to put in, like the underwater ballet, and there's a big, very spectacular, kind of weird looking from a modern perspective, fight scene between lions and elephants at the end. But they kind of just stop the movie for a second and do this thing that they want to do, and then kind of go back to the movie. Like the underwater ballet just kind of pauses everything so that they can get this thing to happen, probably at least half because Johnny Weissmuller was like a champion Olympic swimmer, and they thought, well, we've got to get our money's worth out of having him underwater. But then they kind of just start up again afterwards.
Yeah, it's they have set pieces in it, and they're very clearly constructed as set piece sequences. But then, Hollywood's been doing that throughout its history, and it still does it today. They'll spend a while setting up a set piece, and then you have 20 minutes of people throwing cars at each other or something. So, yeah, I guess that's how Hollywood rolls. Really, is that it's all about the visual spectacle, and so they will just pause the story to give you the visual spectacle for a while. But it's the little touches in this film really get me. As I say, that scene of him blowing on her face. There's the scene before all of that, when the night before, where Jane tries on the clothes from Europe and so on. There's some strange sort of to and fro between Jane and Tarzan throughout that scene. It's quite kind of delicately managed. And the tensions there. But what struck me during that scene in particular was that the sexuality in the film, I feel like it's pitched primarily, I mean, obviously there's a lot of her flesh showing, but a lot of it's pitched at women viewers. Tarzan is presented as this incredibly sexy, quite sort of animal lover. And Jane, the whole storyline is that this English man who was besotted with Jane back in England travels all the way to Africa and through the jungle to find Jane and bring her back to England. And when he does so, she says, "You must be joking. I've got the best life imaginable here." And what she doesn't want to return to is all the kind of constraints and social mores and rules around how she can behave as a woman back in the so-called civilized world. And again, it's that fantasy that people were drawn to with Tarzan, which is to abandon all of that, to kind of just go back to following your instincts. But I felt like in this particular Tarzan film, the primary instinct that's being liberated is her pleasure in sexuality. She's given permission to just enjoy sex with this hunk. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to kind of center in a film, and again in the early 30s, and which I'm sure added to the way in which it was such a disturbing film to the Hays Code and so on. It wasn't just sexuality; it was very much bold, flapper style 30s sexuality.
I was going to say, because he's a very biddable hunk as well. He's presented as powerful, but she tells him what to do, and he just kind of goes and does it. And he never really presents any kind of challenge to her authority at all.
He's just a gorgeous toy boy. And, he also saves her from lions and crocodiles and things, which is quite convenient. But it feels very much like his primary purpose is to be her toy boy.
All right. Well, look, we are quite close to time. I do want to just reiterate that watching the final fight scene in this movie is also amazing, because they decided to stage a fight between lions and elephants, and the way that they've done it is just superimposing lions onto the ends of elephants' trunks to try and make it look like they're being flung around. And it is kind of spectacularly wonky in a way that is quite a lot of fun.
Yeah, one of the great pleasures of watching old films is the special effects. I'm a huge fan of old glass matte painting, where they would hold a sheet of glass up in front of the camera and they would paint a landscape on the glass that would kind of blend with the real landscape that you're seeing through the glass. And so sometimes my huge pleasure in a film is just that it had a really good matte painting in it. The strange things that now draw me to films.
Well, I mean, speaking of special effects, the last one that you had me watch was Son of Kong, which of course, being a King Kong movie, revolves around stop-motion monsters interacting with real people and having fights with each other. And that was just fantastically good fun once they kind of got round to being on Skull Island and fighting the monsters. It was really cool.
Which, to be fair, takes about 2/3 of the movie before they get there. It's such a strange film, again, because it's the sequel to King Kong. It was released in the same year as the original King Kong. They really churned them out. But it's the sequel. And whereas King Kong's actually, it's pretty serious and pretty scary, the original King Kong. But this one, it's a much lighter film. It opens with a whole section which is kind of it's just slapstick comedy. And then you have a whole section of romance where the main character meets the girl, basically, and she. I've got to say, one of the reasons I really like this film is Helen Mack, who plays the woman that he meets. She's another of those classic actors who has a really electric presence on the screen, and she's so great at kind of playing to the camera with these little sly glances and so on. So I enjoyed the romance in this film probably more than anything else. That was my favorite part of it. And then, 2/3 of the way through the film, they finally get to Skull Island and find the son of Kong, who in this film he's rather likable. He's not the big scary monster who's going to kill people. He's actually just a nice guy who's trying to look after the human. So it's a much, much lighter film. You still get a fair amount of stop frame animation, fights between giant apes and dinosaurs and things. It's all part of the fun. But to me, this one was actually, this delivered the kind of the light, pleasurable romance that you'd think Oklahoma was going to deliver. But this one, which is a giant monster movie, actually does deliver it for me.
Yeah, they have really good chemistry, the two leads, which and I guess it's set up why they might spend time together and like each other, which Oklahoma just kind of assumes you will get.
Yeah, the funny thing about it, of course, is that the main character, the hero of this, Carl Denham, he's a relatively uncharismatic, unattractive fellow, really, to be completely blunt. It's in keeping with the classic Hollywood trope of he's an old middle-aged man, really, whereas she's, God knows how old Helen Mack was when she played this role, but probably 19 or something. So, yeah, one does sometimes wonder why she's quite so into him, except that they set up the fact that she's in a desperate situation. Her father has died. She's got nothing. She's going to starve to death, really, or have some terrible life. But she attaches herself to him, I think, largely because he's her ticket out of there. And in fact, she stows away on the boat in order to accompany him. And I think my favorite scene is when she's discovered below decks by the crew and hauled up, and just watching the interaction between her and Carl Denham in that scene. That's my favorite sequence. She's sort of defiant, manipulative, sly, and rather pleased with herself all at once. And she somehow manages to convey it. Again, like Olivia de Havilland and Errol Flynn. It's just that charisma lighting up the screen is part of what is the pleasure of it.
The other thing that I thought was quite interesting there, and perhaps a sign of the times, is that the way they end up getting off the boat and making their way to Skull Island is that the kind of bad ship captain who they pick up as part of the expedition convinces the crew to have a communist revolution, and
yeah.
I wondered how much that was kind of playing into contemporary fears or making jokes about unionization or something like that.
I'm sure, absolutely. I mean, Hollywood was a funny place at the time because it was a mixture of, the very conservative, wealthy financing, and playing to often quite conservative attitudes in their audiences. A mixture of that and communists. I mean, there were a lot of communists in Hollywood too. So you get odd little. I remember watching a Western recently. I can't remember which one it was, but there was a whole storyline around lynching. A lot of Westerns have storylines around lynching, of course. But how often is it an African American getting lynched? Almost never. It's a white cowboy who's about to get lynched by a lynch mob who thinks he's done something. But I realized that the films that were coming out at the time that had all these lynching plot lines, it was precisely at the time that there was a revival of lynching in the South by white supremacists killing African Americans. And it's so interesting that at that moment the films should start increasingly having storylines around it, but they avoid tackling it head on. And I wonder how much it's just that it was kind of in the air, or whether it was certain screenwriters trying to kind of talk about it. I did see this, the particular one I saw, this one the lynch mob was going to lynch a couple of half-castes, half-breeds, as they called them, in that appalling old-fashioned term. So it was characters who were Native American and also had European parents, and so they were about to be lynched, and that was seen as a bad thing in the storyline, and the hero was saving them. But yeah, I thought, what an interesting time to be telling that story. And when you watch these films with a sense of the cultural and social context at the time, it just enriches the experience so much, because you get to see all the hidden shadows and the strange subtext that sometimes even the people making the film weren't aware of. They weren't necessarily thinking of it as a subtext at all. It was just something in the air at the time. And yet we can watch it and we know how much that was the context, and it can really enrich our experience. Not make it more, not necessarily make us like the film more. It's not, I don't know, a lot of the time I'm not watching these films because I want it to be a good film. It's just a window on the past, on this strange, it's an opportunity to step back in time and experience the kind of daydreams and anxieties and desires of people 80, 70 years ago, and then kind of think about how those have carried on through our culture and shaped the stories and daydreams that we have today. And I feel like a lot of stories we tell now have descended from tropes and storylines that now we watch them and find them deeply problematic. For example, a lot of fantasy fiction and science fiction today just finds ways to recreate these older storylines that often are deeply racist. And but it takes those storylines and it rebuilds them in a way that's unconnected to the world that surrounds us now. They'll use orcs instead of Africans and so on. And And somehow they feel like that kind of people aren't aware of it as a racist trope, but it's still the same trope. You know, it carries a whole of baggage. So yeah, watching them is like it's going on an archaeological dig through stories and how we build stories even today. You get to see a lot of the roots of it back in the past.
And I mean, lest people think that this is not a thing that people are getting into fights about, Dungeons and Dragons Twitter is currently having the fight about Dungeons and Dragons' new edition and its decision to include to continue including evil races. So whole groups of people who are just evil because of their birth. And so, you know, if you are at all adjacent to any of those discussions, you'll see lots of people have kind of fights about that stuff. Even as we speak, they will be ongoing.
And as a lifelong Dungeons and Dragons player, I'm definitely adjacent to those conversations. And it's not just Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, you know, I reread Lord of the Rings every now and then because it was a book that enormously shaped my subconscious from when I was about 11 or 12. And yet every time I reread it, I'm struck by how the language that Tolkien used to describe the orcs, you know, swarthy and so on. It's the same adjectives that I find when I read 1930s adventure pulps to describe Africans and dangerous Chinese pirates or so on. You know, the same language that was used for those racial stereotypes is used in a lot of fantasy, including Tolkien, to describe orcs, which, so, you know, it's a real part of the DNA of the fantasy genre. And I feel like we're doing ourselves a disservice if we just turn it into if we feel that the only way to preserve the value of something like Tolkien is to pretend it's not there, because it is there. It's part of what Lord of the Rings comes from, is a whole history of Edwardian colonial adventure stories. So, yeah, of course that's part of its DNA. And we shouldn't just kind of say, oh, well, that's fine then, and ignore it. But it also doesn't, to me, mean that we throw out Lord of the Rings. It just means that we have to read it with a much more multi-layered awareness of those complexities, because that's our whole culture is saturated with that. Racism is such a major part of how our culture has evolved in the last couple of 100 years, and we have to face that. We have to be aware of it and be real about it. But it's not like we can stop belonging to it. We can't stop being part of our culture because it's saturated us too. It's part of how our brain works. We've wired it through our brain so much. So it's just being aware of it, being critically aware of it, and being prepared to turn and face the shadows in it, even when we are at the same time enjoying the beauty and the bright lights and the parts of it that deeply move us.
Well, I think that's actually a pretty fantastic kind of thesis statement for why these old movies are worth watching. So thank you very much for that, Dylan. It's been a lot of fun having this conversation with you. There are two things that I like to do by way of finishing off this podcast. The first is to ask if you've got any kind of further reading or further watching that you would recommend people go and do if they've maybe seen these movies or the things that we've talked about sound appealing or interesting. Are there other resources you would suggest people investigate?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a huge number of films that you can watch just for the sheer joy of it. That's one of the nice things about exploring older films, is that there's a whole history of wonderful films that you can dive into. But a really good starting point, I think, a really enjoyable starting point, is a documentary series made by a guy called Mark Cousins, who's a film historian, and he made a series called The Story of Film in Odyssey, which is a 15-part documentary series, and he's really exploring film across the entire world. So there's a lot of it he's telling the story of film in Nigeria, in Iran, in all sorts of places. He draws out of that history a lot of filmmakers who have been unfairly ignored, women filmmakers who made an enormous impact but then kind of got written out of history. But he also, especially the first few episodes, I think are really, really interesting for touching on what makes film so magic as a medium. And it's also a book. He also wrote a book that's a history of film called The Story of Film, based on that series. So to me, that's a really good place to start. Also, Martin Scorsese's made a couple of great documentaries about American film and Italian film.
Excellent. Well, those sound like good places to look. And certainly I was going to say that the thing I was reminded of when you were talking about kind of seeing the different values of the past, basically kind of reflected in the stories that they chose to tell, I was struck by the similarity, sort of, to the experience of watching something that's kind of from completely outside your cultural context. I was thinking in particular of watching Atanajwat, which is the Inuit movie, made entirely in, I forget the name of the language, but in an Inuit language, retelling an Inuit legend. And it's fascinating because you have almost no common cultural context for what's going on if you're a Pākehā New Zealander, and so you just kind of have to work out what the values are and why people are behaving the way that they're behaving as you go along, and that's a very interesting experience as a white person who doesn't often get put in that position.
Yeah, deeply, because often when you start watching a film, you find yourself kind of surrendering to its vision, and if the vision is one that doesn't, it's like not your language, your visual language or your cultural language. It's a deeply thrilling experience. It's really wonderful. I got to say, I mean, film, I guess partly because of my dad, film has been a lifelong love. He still often, directs me to wonderful films that open up whole new ways of seeing. But every time I watch a new film, I feel like I'm learning how to see all over again. And I think that's the most exciting thing about it.
So the last thing I like to do is basically give you an opportunity to plug things. Do you have specific things you want to plug? Obviously, you are a fairly well-published cartoonist, so if people want to find your work, that's not too difficult to come by. I know that the public library here in Palmy has the Magic Pen and also another one that I forget the name of. It's
probably Hicksville.
Yeah, I think it's Hicksville that they have. So there are those, but are there other things that you would like to plug as well?
I would just say any chance you get to go to a zine fest. I know Palmerston North has a fantastic zine fest every year. Go along and just explore and pick up things that catch your eye. And because the zine fests are now where a lot of really exciting stuff is happening. In storytelling and visual media, people making their own little poetry books and comics and so on. And Palmerston North, as I say, has a great one. Wellington has a great one. They're all over the country. So just as with film, just dive in, pick up something that you don't understand, and let it teach you how to see all over again.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show is produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. You can find me on the internet at Objective Realty on Twitter, and you can find the show on Facebook under Reserved Recommendations. If you've got a reserved recommendation of your own, feel free to pitch it to me in either of those two places. And if you enjoyed the show, why not go ahead and recommend it to a friend? You can find past episodes at www.npr.nz/show/reserved. on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit radio station. If you enjoy this or any of their other fine audio programming, why not fling them a couple of dollars? Go to npr.nz/donate for more information.